Welcome to the NatRefs Show, a weekly podcast on the ever-changing world of natural refrigerants, brought to you by Shecco, with support from component maker PepsiCo. Today, we will be discussing the major news items impacting the world of natural refrigerants. My name is Michael Garry, editor of Shecco's Accelerate America magazine, a North American editor for Shecco, and I will be hosting today's podcast from Shecco's New York area bureau outside of New York City. I'm joined today by my colleague in Brussels, Belgium, Charlotte McLaughlin, who is the European-based multimedia reporter. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, Michael.
Good to be with you. We'll also be hearing from Anti Gkizelis on the market development team at Shecco, who's also based in Brussels. So today we'll be discussing some really interesting developments happening in the U.S., starting with a lawsuit that was recently brought by 11 states against the EPA regarding the EPA's handling of HFC regulations. I was attending this week the Global Cold Chain Expo in Chicago, where I spoke to a number of folks, and I'll be telling you a bit about that. Finally, we'll hear from Andy, who will discuss some recent news from the Refrigerants Naturally group based in Europe, which tracks the installations of natural refrigerants systems by its members, who include some large brands like Coke, Pepsi, Red Bull, etc. So, starting off, we'll talk about this very interesting case, which happened this week. It's yet another twist in the ongoing saga relating to the lawsuit and the legal case that took place last year, where the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia told the EPA they can no longer force manufacturers that have already replaced ozone-depleting substances with HFCs to remove those HFCs. But what happened was the EPA went further than that in its recent guidance, basically precluding any regulation of HFCs, which really was not quite what the lawsuit had in mind. So tell us what happened, Charlotte, in regard to that.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So what happened is that, well, from the position of the 11 attorney generals that are now suing the EPA, is that the original court case, the EPA has misinterpreted it and has gone further than the court case told them to, basically. So the original court case in August 2017 was two chemical companies sued the EPA and their regulation of HFCs. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the District Columbia Court Circuit, in a 3-judge panel, ruled that the EPA lacked authority to require manufacturers to replace HFCs used as a substitute for ODS, or ozone-depleting substances. But the court did say that, for those who haven't yet switched from like CFCs, HCFCs to HFCs, they can go from HCFCs straight towards a lower GWP alternative and be prohibited from using HFCs. So those types of regulations should still stay in place for things that haven't, come into force yet. So the EPA vacated the original regulations enacted in 2015 under the Significant New Alternatives policy that prohibited uses of HFCs for certain applications at certain dates. And they vacated all of these rules. The 11 attorney generals maintained that they didn't have to do this, and they're suing the EPA because they believe that they went further than they should have, basically.
That's right. Yeah, they basically said that the EPA issued a guidance, kind of just a fiat, that said that, well, we're not going to do anything in terms of regulating HFCs. And normally, you don't just, the EPA doesn't operate that way. They do a rulemaking that, brings in comments from, interested stakeholders and so on. And then they, before they make a ruling, but in this case, they didn't do that. Or they started, actually, after they issued their guidance, they then started the rulemaking process, but sort of putting the cart before the horse, so they didn't do it in the correct order. And that's what the attorney generals were unhappy about. It's of course the EPA, the Trump's administration's EPA, has been sued countless times for its regulatory rollback actions. This is just the latest example of that. Yeah, it's kind of complicated. The EPA in 2015 said that certain high GWP HFCs like R404A, for example, can't be used in certain applications like commercial refrigeration by certain dates, and these two foreign chemical companies, Mexichem and Arkema, sued, challenged that in court, and the court ruled their favor, but only partially in their favor. They just said that, if a company or manufacturer has already replaced, an ozone-depleting refrigerant like R22 with an HFC, then that's it. They can't be required to replace then the HFC again. It's only a one-time, replace means once in the viewpoint of the court. Now, this is a controversial interpretation, and in fact, we saw that the original ruling has been appealed now to the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah, so added to this, I don't know what to call it anymore, mess that started in August 2017, added to this, two chemical companies, Honeywell and Chemours, who were, and along with the environmental NGO NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, have also decided to re-challenge the case because they were actually interveners in the original case. So they've decided to challenge the case and go, because their court appeal for the District Court of Columbia was, they were told they couldn't appeal, so the next step was for them to go to the Supreme Court. Now they've petitioned the Supreme Court. If they're successful, the Supreme Court overturns the District Court's ruling, then none of this will matter, and I guess the EPA will have to go back to their own rules again, which will, I guess, be another complication in this evolving story. It seems to be like a new thing every week, basically.
Yeah, it's very confusing, and just has so many moving parts at this point. But basically, the EPA, it's still, this whole issue of HFC regulation is still very much up in the air. And now with this new lawsuit by these attorneys general, it becomes, adds yet another layer of complication. But we'll just have to see. We'll have to see what happens. I, of course, wrote extensively about this in the recent issue of Accelerate America magazine, the June-July issue, in the cover story called The Policy Quagmire, for those who want to delve deeper into this topic. So moving on, I was attending this week the Global Cold Chain Expo in Chicago at McCormick Place. And it's actually was co-located with several other trade shows, but I focused on the expo and spoke to a number of refrigeration companies dealing with the industrial sector mostly, and a couple of stories that I came up with this week. I'll just briefly mention. One was that Heatcraft told me that they're installing their first transcritical CO2 system at a cold storage plant. This is yet another example of the growing interest in CO2 refrigeration in the industrial sector. It's more traditionally been in the supermarket commercial sector, but now we're seeing a lot of interest by different OEMs and end users in using CO2 as an industrial refrigerant instead of ammonia, which has been the traditional refrigerant in the industrial sector for decades. But also some of the, it's being used now instead of some of the halocarbon refrigeration systems as well. Now, Heatcraft was just one of the companies I spoke to about this, about the use of CO2 in industrial. Others included Carnot, Hill Phoenix, Zero Zone. I spoke to a contractor there, Climate Pros, that had actually just installed a CO2 system at a company called Mama La Rosa that makes dough, pizza dough in Michigan. They installed a CO2 transcritical system. So, yeah, I mean, we're really seeing a shift, fundamental shift here in the industrial sector.
But Michael, what kind of capacities are we talking for these larger CO2 industrial systems?
They are certainly larger capacities than what you see in the commercial sector. So I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but certainly, they're 20 to 30% higher capacity systems. They use bigger compressors, bigger horsepower compressors, and to accommodate the tonnage required at the industrial level. Now, another interesting piece of news that I picked up at the expo was from this Italian compressor manufacturer, Frascold. Their CEO, Christian Ellefson, told me that Frascold has sold 3 screw compressors that will be used in a propane chiller application by a pharmaceutical company in a San Francisco Bay Area plant. Now, this is significant because, again, propane, like CO2, it's not something you see in industrial applications. And I mean, you consider this pharmaceutical plant an industrial application. I mean, it's something that we've seen in Europe with propane chillers, both industrial and commercial. But in the U.S., there's only one example. I guess the oil and gas industry does use propane, but in elsewhere in the conventional industrial sector and in commercial sector, it's not really available. I mean, Whole Foods, I wrote about this in 2016. Whole Foods Market installed a propane chiller at a supermarket in California. They got a special permission to do this from the EPA because, of course, you can't use more than 150 grams of propane in a commercial application. Whole Foods use like 285 pounds of propane on the rooftop of this store in their propane chillers. The chiller that this pharmaceutical company is using, and I couldn't get the name of it without the permission of the company, but the propane chiller is also using a couple hundred pounds of propane. Which again, is outside the realm of what's allowed by the EPA. But again, the Ellefson said that the pharmaceutical company got permission to do this. He couldn't provide details on that. So basically we're seeing, but he's kind of confident that there will be more propane chillers of this type used in the U.S. like at companies like breweries. He said are good places for this to be used. So I thought that was an interesting development.
Definitely. I think we're seeing that sort of in Europe as well. Like when I went to Mostar earlier this year, like there was a lot of Frascold, of course. They were displaying 2 new propane chiller compressors specifically for chillers, and along with other companies like Snowkey as well. And there were several new propane chillers on display at Mostar. So I think we're definitely seeing some degree of development in this market, but what sort of application that leads into, I don't think anybody really knows yet. I guess the most interesting thing about propane chillers is that you can really also use them for air conditioning applications. So like commercial buildings and stuff could also be air conditioned.
Absolutely. So yeah, propane just continues to become more and more popular in a variety of applications, from the home refrigerators and air conditioners to commercial coolers in supermarkets to chillers in industrial applications. So it's certainly, we're seeing more and more propane being used. The question is always the flammability and the safety, which is also tied into the charge size, and that's certainly in flux now as the IEC considers raising the charge, the standard for charge limits to 500 grams. And that's being voted on as we speak. So there's a lot going on in the propane arena. So finally, our last article, topic that we'll discuss will be what's happening at the Refrigerants Naturally group in Europe. And for that, we'll hear from Anti Gkizelis.
Hi, so I'm here with Anti Gkizelis from the market development team of shecco, and we're going to talk about refrigerants naturally. And they've released some new report or something, Andy?
Yes, that is correct. Hello, Charlotte. So the Refrigerants Naturally is an initiative taking action against global warming and ozone layer depletion by supporting a regulatory and political framework that encourages investment in climate-friendly technologies. This was formed in 2004 by PepsiCo, Red Bull, Coca-Cola and Unilever, each of them entering on different periods. And together with Greenpeace and the UN Environment, they have set out to accomplish a very ambitious mission. That mission was basically to set clear industry-leading targets for an accelerated transition from F-gas refrigerants such as HFCs, HCFCs, CFCs to natural refrigerants. Basically, in numbers, this means that the members of Refrigerants Naturally aimed at 100% F-gas free procurement in new point-of-sale systems wherever technically and legally feasible. Through this, direct competitors have worked together to create a global impact and move the industry toward improving their carbon footprint and making cooling and freezing technologies environmentally sustainable.
Okay, well, that sounds very interesting. Can you give me some more information about it? Or?
Sure. So by the end of 2017, the Refrigerants Naturally members had collectively implemented 7.25 million natural refrigerant units, and this means that they avoided the emission of around 43.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. To put this into more perspective, this is equal to the annual emissions of more than 8.86 million passengers vehicles, and this means that by the end of 2017, 3 of the member companies had reached their 100% natural refrigerant procurement goal, with the last member company being able to reach it by 2020.
Okay, so everybody's doing really well at committing to natural refrigerants.
Indeed, and as you already know from this, it is very rare that an initiative such ambitious as this can say mission accomplished. And with the collective efforts of these companies, the Refrigerants Naturally initiative is able to proudly say mission accomplished. And now, following this success, the members collectively decided to officially end the active engagements in the Refrigerants Naturally initiative by the end of 2017, and this is creating space for new ventures looking at other aspects of cooling to be addressed by a new generation of companies.
Okay, and do you think this is going to encourage more other end users to follow the same direction as these companies?
I really do believe that it can, because this initiative achieved to show that competitors, when they are teamed together for the same beneficial cause with a clear plan and the support needed, they can realize ambitious targets for a sustainable transition to green technologies. And now the members actually are calling to other industry stakeholders and end users of refrigeration and freezing equipment to follow this example and collectively make possible what seems impossible.
All right, well, thanks very much for your time, Andy.
Thank you very much, Charlotte.
So that wraps up today's NatRefs show. I want to thank my colleagues Charlotte and Andy, and thank you very much for listening. We'll catch you next week on the NatRefs show.